Cannot hear you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this ETUI webinar on the labor environment nexus, exploring new frontiers in labor law. My name is Kalina Arabagieva, and I'm a researcher here at the ETUI. And before I say anything of substance, I just wanted to mention that we have interpretation today in both French and Spanish. So if you would like to listen to the discussion in those languages, you can click on the interpretation icon on the bar at the bottom of the Zoom screen and choose your preferred language. So to the topic of our webinar, the labor environment nexus, or the relationship between labor and workers and the natural environment, it's a topic that is gaining increasing attention, of course, as the physical effects of climate change on workers, such as heat waves, for example, but also others, become ever more visible and more acute. But of course, also in light of the industrial transformations underway in many places, which are driven by climate change mitigation policies that affect jobs and livelihoods. And there is by now a rich literature on various aspects of this relationship in the field of environmental labor studies, but also in the field of labor law. We've seen an increased interest in the topic in recent years through various seminars and conferences, but also articles and even books, such as the one edited by Consuelo Chacategui, who is on the screen with us today, on the labor law and ecology. But what we will discuss today is the set of contributions to this topic that was recently published in a double special issue of the International Journal of Comparative Labor Law and Industrial Relations, with the same title as our webinar. And the contributions to this special issue are the product of a project that we started last year with the symposium in last October that was organized in collaboration with Aix-Marseille University, and which brought together a really wonderful group of labor law scholars and scholars in some other disciplines to explore some of the fundamental questions concerning the relationship between workers, labor law, law in general, and also to the natural environment and to environmental protection. And here I would really like to thank all of the participants in this symposium, presenters, but also discussants, the audience, as well as some of the students who are present for their contribution to this project and for their very active engagement and inspiring ideas. And I would also like to thank the other organizers of the symposium and co-guest editors of the special issue. These are Alexis Bugada, Cello Chacategui, Paolo Tomasetti, and Ania Zbigniewska, some of whom are also visible on the screen and with us today. So this double special issue includes many of the papers that were presented at the symposium. And what we would like to do in this webinar is to present some of the main findings of the papers and also to reflect on their implications for trade unions and for industrial relations institutions more widely. And so to do that, we will first hear from Paolo Tomasetti, who is professor of labor law at the University of Milan and also associate researcher here at the ETUI, and who will take you through the main questions that the contributions seek to address and the themes that emerge from them. And then we ask two experts in industrial relations from different academic disciplines to share with us some reflections on the themes of the special issue. So we will hear from Guy Mundlach, who is professor of labor law and industrial relations at Tel Aviv University. So Guy, thank you again for being with us despite the very difficult situation where you are. And we will also hear from Valeria Pulignano, who is professor in sociology at the Center for Sociological Research at KU Leuven. And after these two speakers, we will also hear from some discussants. We've got Ben Lennon here, who is the policy advisor on climate change at the European Trade Union Confederation, and Anne Davies, who is professor of labor law and public policy at the University of Oxford, and also the editor of the International Journal of Comparative Labor Law and Industrial Relations. It's a very long title. So Anne, I would really like to say a huge thank you for making space for this topic in the journal. And I would also like to say a special thank you to the deputy editor of the journal, Amir Pasfuchs, who very kindly supported us throughout the publication process, but who couldn't join us today. And then last but not least, we will come back to one of the contributors to the special issue. So we also have Anil Verma, who is Emeritus Professor of Industrial Relations and Human Resource Management at the University of Toronto. And Anil will offer some reflections as well from the perspective of his expertise in industrial relations, and perhaps also as an author have the opportunity to respond to some of the comments of the others. And we also have some of the other contributors who kindly joined us today to answer some questions, perhaps raise some questions and offer any further comments. And there will be a chance to ask questions from the audience, which you can put in the Q&A. So with that, I would like to pass the floor to Paolo first.
Thank you very much, Kalina, and welcome to everybody, and thanks for being here. My task today is to introduce an overall overview on the special issue, its main contents, arguments, and main findings, to open the discussion with the two invited discussants and the fantastic panelists that we are invited today to analyze with you, with us, the outcomes of this double special issue published in the International Journal of Comparative Labor Law and Industrial Relations. So with this double special issue, we wanted to ask and try to answer 4 basic questions. Why should labor law be concerned with environmental issues? How does labor law interact with environmental crises? How does the environmental crisis affect labor law and working conditions? And how can labor justice and environmental sustainability be reconciled? So approximately, more or less directly, the 9 papers in this special issue try to address these 4 broad questions. The 9 papers could be divided into 3 big groups, even if this is just to simplify the presentation of the special issue, because the different papers within each different group really speak to each other. So it's not possible to really sharply divide them into these 3 groups, but we could, in a way, identify a first group of paper by Simon Deakin, Ania Zibreska, Flavia Maximon, and Lise Dermine that look at epistemological aspect of the labor environment nexus. They try to rethink labor law in a warming world. They try to rethink the normative foundation of labor law to make it more attuned to the challenges of the environmental crisis, climate change, and global warming. So this is the first group of papers. The second group of papers look at the effects of both climate change, but also environmental policies and decarbonization policies on vulnerable groups. Namely, this is a perspective from the Global South, for example, how countries from the Global South are affected by environmental policies, but they also look at vulnerable workers, like workers in the informal economy or women. And therefore, this group of papers look at the cleavages in the labor market and how these different cleavages, the gender one, the geographical one, the formal and informal economy, are differently affected by climate change and environmental policies. While the last group of papers by Frances Flanagan, Tonya Novitz, and Sergio Canalda Criado elaborate on the principle of just transition, but in a critical way, in a way to emphasize the limits of this principle as it is enshrined today in international treaties and international policies, decarbonization policies. And they also look at what are the differences in terms of impact of the principle of just transition and the idea of justice in the transition away from fossil fuels for different categories of workers. So this is the overall picture of the special issue. And now let me introduce you to the key messages and main arguments made by the authors in this special issue. So let's start from the first group of papers, those concerned with epistemology of labor law, but law in general, as it is shaped in Western jurisdiction first and in capitalism in general. So this group of colleagues try to conceptualize the ambivalence of law in general and labor law in particular vis-a-vis the environmental crisis. So both labor law and environmental law are both part of the problem and part of the solution to the environmental crisis. This is because both labor law and environmental law, but also general principles of law, general institutions of law like property and the articulation of property rights are constitutive elements of capitalism. So as long as we assume that, drawing, for example, on Jason's more idea of capitalocene, the environmental crisis is the effect of the current division of labor in our socioeconomic model, then law in general and labor law in particular as constitutive elements of capitalism are in a way responsible towards the reproduction of the environmental crisis. So here the claim is that we should find a way to rebalance production and reproduction in a way to cope with the problem of ecological limits to growth, for example, that impede the possibility of having continuous accumulation of capital and growth as a precondition for redistribution. And redistribution is one of the main goals of classical and orthodox labor law, meaning redistribution of power and resources from capital to labor, for example. So how can we cope with this problem in face of ecological limits to growth? But for example, in Anya's and Flavia's terms, rebalance production and reproduction implies decolonizing labor law. And this means shifting the focus of labor law from exploitation, which is the typical narrative of traditional labor law normative foundations, to expropriation of labor, land, and natural resources, recognizing that decommodification of labor and land, as well as welfare and development for some, might happen at the expenses of others, human beings and ecosystems in condition of vulnerability. So in this connection, this would imply make labor law more inclusive for different forms of work beyond productive work, for example, and this is an argument also by Elise Dermine, inclusive for different ways of seeing the world, the regulation and the relationship between humans and nature, but also inclusive of diverse legal rationalities, which does not necessarily correspond or coincide to orthodox and Eurocentric labor law normative foundations. This broadly is also the argument of the Elise Dermine paper, which tries to rethink labor law beyond productivism. She tries to decouple social law, particularly from the idea of continuous growth and accumulation, and she looks at different institutions that could provide welfare for workers and a positive impact for the planet, such as, for example, reduction of working time. If we go to the second group of papers, as I mentioned before, these authors focus on the regressive effects of climate policies on different groups of workers, especially women, in the case of Sandra Fredman, but also on the north-south cleavage, in a context in which inequalities are on the rise. And many of these inequalities are also the result of both climate change and sometimes environmental policies. So they try to understand how to decouple decarbonization policies and also environmental policies in general from having negative effects for certain categories of workers. So the answer to these dilemmas is to make labor law more inclusive, again, inclusive and protective for different groups of vulnerable workers, and mainly for workers beyond productive activities, beyond activities that have an economic impact which is measurable immediately, but that in a way could contribute to social reproduction and to a social utility which is not necessarily immediately visible according to the normal standards through which we measure productivity and economic effects of productivity. This also implies rethink the idea of just transition to make it more attuned to the needs of these vulnerable workers and communities. And here we have the focus on certain countries, for example, countries from Latin America that have a very different and diverse labor markets compared to the European one or the North American one. We have a nice case study about waste speakers by Ana Gomez, Anil Verma, and Eric Guimarães, emphasizing how, for example, waste speakers create a social utility without being recognized by the law. They are not included within labor law boundaries, and they are not protected by traditional trade unions. They have more protection, for example, by environmental law than labor law. So this is also a call for, again, expanding the boundaries of labor law to cover also new forms of work that are carried out at the crossroad between formal and informal economy, and try to overcome also this distinction between formality and informality as it is shaped by global north legal rationality. And then if we go to the last group of papers, again, here the critique is against the principle, some shortcomings of the principle of just transition, especially in the part that continue to legitimize the extraction of fossil fuels, despite the imperative of transitioning away from coal and from oil and natural gas. I mean, these kind of extractive activities are still there. And for example, Frances Flanagan make a case to rethink the idea of just transition in a way to emphasize the need to cessation of this extractivism of natural resources, recognizing also the inequality of bargaining power of the actors involved in the just transition process. So who shapes the idea of justice in the transition away from fossil fuels? We have this narrative, which is also rhetoric, about the role of trade unions, workers' representatives in general, in negotiating the transition away from fossil fuel. But we should also recognize, as Frances Flanagan underlines, that this group of actors, agents, it's sometimes voiceless vis-a-vis the employers, vis-a-vis also the state, that cannot, due to extensive public debt, for example, implement sound protective policies for workers and communities that are affected by decarbonization policies. Then there are analyses related to the channels for workers and workers' representatives, including trade unions, to raise the voice of workers in shaping the idea of just transition. One of these channels is the human rights litigation on climate change. namely climate change litigation, which according to Tonjanovitz should include also labor concerns. And if we look at European Convention of Human Rights and the analysis of case law of the European Court on Human Rights, there is a double relevance of climate litigation for workers and working conditions under Articles 2 and 8 of the Convention, the right to life and the right to private and family life. But there is also potential of including workers' voice in human rights litigation on environmental aspects. And this could be a good channel also to shape the idea of just transition in a more effective way. In a similar vein, Sergio Canalda paper argues that the EU quality framework on anticipation of change and corporate restructuring could be another channel, an institutional channel, to guarantee workers' voice towards climate neutrality. So this is the overall picture coming out the special issue, the main messages and the main claims by the author. As Kalina said in her introduction, the goals of this webinar was to socialize these outcomes with the community of labor lawyers and beyond, and other scholars from close disciplines, but also to discuss these findings with the ETUC, the European Trade Union Confederation, and the trade unions in general. And we wanted to emphasize and reflect on the implication of such findings for unions and industrial relations institutions. So this is the main goal of this webinar. And this goal is in line, and I want to emphasize this, with the latest manifesto from the ETUC, the European Trade Union Confederation, that was released in the latest Congress of May 2023. And if we look at the action program behind the manifesto, we have a very important point, a very important paragraph called A New Sustainable Economic and Social Model, where the ETUC clearly states that building an economic model based on the sustainability first principle and fighting inequalities in Europe and globally must be the ETUC's priority. Sustainability means thinking holistically in a way that bases the economy on respect for the planet and on social justice. And the Europe we want, this is the voice of the ETUC, must deliver a social ecological transition that answers environmental change with social progress. And this requires a change in our economic model, moving away from the current focus on growth and consumption. And it means directing the economy and employment towards achieving sustainability, equality, well-being, and the collective good. So this message really resonates with the outcomes of this special issue. And I think it's a good starting to discuss what could be the role of trade unions and workers' representative in turning all this very great idea, academic idea, into reality in real life of industrial relations dynamics. And last but not least, I want to mention that this conversation about possible convergences between labor and environmental justice will continue in this very first MOOC, massive open access online course launched and organized by the ETUI. This will be a 1-month online course that will precisely try to engage both academics and practitioners and workers' representatives in a dialogue to co-create concrete ways to achieve both an environmental and labor justice simultaneously, to deconstruct the apparent conflict between labor and environment, and create pathways for cooperation also between the labor movement and the environmental groups. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paolo, for this very nice overview, and also for mentioning the course. So I see among the audience, there are some trade union representatives. So I really hope that that will be something that is also of interest to them. But right now, I'm really keen to hear the reactions, the reflections of our speakers who are not involved in the project. And so I will go ahead and pass the floor directly to Guy. So Guy, the floor is yours.
Is that okay? Can you see that?
Yes, we can see that. Thank you.
Okay, but the only thing is I lost my notes. So 1 second. Sorry for this.
No worries, no stress.
Okay, I'm gonna do an anesthetic share screen, but I hope that will work. Okay, can you see it, even though that it's not the full screen?
I think it's fine.
Okay, so okay, got it. So I really thank the opportunity to comment on this fascinating volume. And drawing on Paolo's overview, the volume actually starts with envisioning a future that is not imminent or evident in any kind of way, and gradually moves to the description of present and past. So to consider what is the state of the labor environment nexus, which I will refer kind of in shorthand as red and green, I will present my observations in the reverse order from the end to the start. So the traditional concern from which just transition, as far as I understand, evolved was that there is an inherent tension between red and green. And I think that Flanagan does best to remind us of this basic dilemma. Green wants to shut down polluting industries, establish new ones that produce and use new forms of energy. Red wants to protect the workers of the old order. Now, this is not just a question of shifting workers from one place to another. It is also a shift from traditional industry, large establishments, and occupations that were the trade union's stronghold. Think about coal miners, workers in monopolistic electric companies, in traditional industry. At the same time, new energy evolved as an unorganized sector, requiring trade unions to work creatively and investing much human energy to ensure that the new green does not establish itself as being outside the circuits of organized labor. Now, in the literature on the meaning of power, it is acknowledged that setting the agenda can affect the way that we address such a conflict. We must choose in our allegiance between are we red or are we green when addressing this conflict. And of course, there are political agents that strategically benefit from enduring conflict between red and green because it weakens both movement and engages them in kind of internal rivalry. Now, just transition suggests that it is possible to generate new solutions that will take us beyond this conflict between the red and the green. Now, a great example for this is demonstrated in Gipponi's article on the Chilean Supreme Court decision that both upheld a policy to decarbonize electricity generation, but required at the same time that the state develop a guarantee to workers' rights. So rather than choose red and green, it is possible to reinstate a new agenda, and that's to transition to green and invest more money in the relocation of red. Now, of course, this win-win strategy may have a price. It may be a price on the state or the citizens who will pay more taxes or on employers. It's also a solution that focuses on costs, but it does not address the fundamental challenges for the red camp, such as the loss of strong trade union bases to unorganized sectors. And furthermore, we always have to remember that there is a long distance between a human rights decision of a higher court and the daily experience of workers in a state of dislocation. Just transition must take into consideration who can ascertain that the principle, the big human rights principle, is actually translated into action. The articles that detail the components of just transition theory cover both principles and the process of representation. So Novitz and Giupponi refer to human rights that can frame the just transition process. Flanagan highlights the importance of detailing environmental norms to accommodate labor concerns beyond mere token recognition. Canada points at the importance of considering structures of representation, which can address the gap between the legal principles and the actual experience of workers and communities, what we call law in action. And I take his article as a launchpad to point at the importance of collective agency in just transition. Now, this issue comes up a few times throughout the volume, but I think is not fully problematized. It requires a systemic treatment, particularly as just transition evolved as a framework for trade unions' involvement. So Canada aptly notes that it is necessary to consider the structures of representation at multiple levels in order to accommodate the needs of just transition solutions. And I would like to add to that. The quest to mediate green and red brings throughout the volume a call for accommodating different voices. Environmental agents should be integrated into red negotiations. There should be adequate gender representation. So we should incorporate feminist NGOs, for example. There should be voices of South and North. These are all important ideas. But they also raise a concern that is not addressed, and that's that plural voices can also make negotiations way more difficult. Sometimes difficulty is a virtue if it extends more legitimacy, and it's better to wait a bit to have more inclusion at the price of hasty solutions. But sometimes difficulty can be an impasse on the red front, on the green front, or on both. The stable structures of tripartism have their vices and virtues. And it seems the easier solution is to spread over to as many agents and levels of negotiations. And I sympathize with this, but I think it requires reflections on its limits. The pluralization of agency further requires to reconsider the traditional pillars of labor law, mostly at the national level, but also at the transnational level. Is it possible to match recognition process of trade unions and employers associations and prescribe who will speak on behalf of gender, who will speak on behalf of the environment, who will speak on behalf of future generations, of minorities, of people with disabilities? Should the laws that govern collective bargaining change to accommodate everyone? Should the topics permitted for bargaining be reframed? Should there be a new concept of collective bargaining that extends labor? Why do we resist devising new trilateral or multilateral types of bargaining that are similar to collective bargaining for other fields of social engineering? And which experiments of institutionalized pluralization can serve as the guidelines for this? So an additional step in thinking about the labor environment nexus appears as we start making our way towards the beginning of the volume. So the traditional stapling of labor and environmental concerns suggests that it is possible to set a new agenda. But maybe there is also here in this volume an argument that it's actually a serious necessity. And I think that takes us one step further. The traditional view would be that you add labor concerns into environmental concerns. So you just can't work towards a green future without considering the people who do the actual work. So that we know. But here we have also two other perspectives. Ana Gomez and her colleagues pointed the reverse. Labor law has a blind spot, and actually a rather large one, missing out on extending protection to informal work, to non-standard work, to unpaid labor, to independent workers, to freelancers, and more. Changing labor law, which developed in a path-determined way, is doable. And there are signs of change towards greater inclusion, but it is very heavy lifting. In their study, they demonstrate that it was actually environmental law that encouraged a move from highly informal independent work to well-organized co-ops that extend dignity, security, and representation. A different way of thinking about this red-green melting pot is that we already reached an advanced stage of integration that it is possible to start critiquing the red-green nexus as a unified field and identify its shortcomings as a whole. So Fredman suggests such critique from a gender perspective, and the co-production of Zwiecka and Maximo present a similar move with a critique from the global south. This critique of the melting pot of the green and the red is indicative, I think, of a very quick maturation of just transition as a whole new field, independent in itself. Now, the attempt to forge a stronger interdependent link, red and green, is demonstrated in this volume in two different approaches. So I return to Ana Gomez and her peers who use an inductive approach and draw on an empirical finding in a very specific case, the waste pickers in Brazil. But they draw on this example in an inductive way, demonstrating the necessity to draw on one field to advance a significant change to the habits, to the practices, and to the institutions that are otherwise difficult to put in place where there are sticky institutions in the other field. So it's this kind of originality of interjection. A second approach to design a stronger bond between the fields is aptly demonstrated by Dermain's articulation of sustainability, which serves as a guide to rethinking in a comprehensive way a new body of law that both follows and makes a departure from similar concepts of social law in the past. I think that the attempt that Dermain's pivotal contribution leads us into the two opening articles by Dicken and by Zwiecka and Maximo, who, despite their differences, make a greater departure from the focus of integrating red and green building blocks. Instead, they point at the problem at its totality. It's the whole political economy system that includes modules of private law that constitute markets, environmental scarcity and nationalism. This vision seeks to reconfigure the whole structure. The latter contribution compiles themes that were presented in more specific articles, most notably universality and comprehensive inclusion of employees and non-employees, of traditionally standard and non-standard, of waged and non-waged labor. The fact that this line of thought was demonstrated in previous articles I mentioned, then raises the possibility of reaching some of these extreme solutions in a more incremental fashion with our existing toolbox and lexicon that we already have. Dicken takes us on a short tour of several centuries of capitalist development, noting that perhaps capitalism as we know it reached its limits and it needs to be reconfigured at the source. It's not about correction, it's not about correcting the operations of the market by social law, but by rewriting the law of property. And I would also add the need to rethink the law of contracts and the law of torts, as it is rather evident from analysis, for example, in this field of the law of global value chains. And it is possible to draw closure to the circle of articles and point back to the starting point, Tanya Novitz's practical inventory of human rights, which suggests that it's not only the market that we need to fix, but also the law governing the public sphere, reaching deep into a substantive concept of democracy. So these final articles suggest the most far-reaching ideas for conceiving the nexus of labor and environment. In this, we find the strength, but they also point to the thorny road ahead. The strength clearly lies in a vision, one that takes us away from the Sisyphic task of contemplating strategies for local challenges. Many activists and social entrepreneurs on the red and on the green frontiers are constantly developing ideas on how to take the next step. The outcome is a patchwork of strategies that may coalesce into a systemic response and may sometimes remain localized and difficult to diffuse further. In this hard work, it is important to always have some kind of a vision, one that we can write on the wall in big letters, so we can look at it all the time and we can imagine that there is a different future. And at the same time, attempting universality or rewriting property rules requires much more details, considerations of trade-offs, intended and unintended consequences. The literature on degrowth, for example, often serves now the need for imagination, for a vision, but sometimes it remains unclear what it actually prescribes. And as I noted, sometimes it leads to very earthly ideas, such as a better work-life balance. But for that, we don't need the full detour into the realm of imagination. It is a topic that we're already dealing with existing and familiar agents and institutions. And at the same time, far more reaching horizons, we need to go back to a set of questions I raised earlier. What is the political economy of such change? Who will do the change? Is it possible to achieve by means of incremental development, or do we need a wholesale revolution? What are the costs and benefits of these two options, incremental or radical? And here in the ETUI venue, does it require to adjust trade union strategies, or perhaps to reconsider who are the agents of collective representation for social law? Are we willing to take a path that may exert hardship on existing agents and existing institutions with a hope for better ones instead? Or should we fear losing traditional and well-proven methods of doing things? And here I'd like to conclude with the starting point of the volume as Dicken takes us back and builds on Karl Polanyi, who suggested that both labor and land are fictitious commodities. The fundamental difficulty, in my view, is that one is developing in the trajectory of excess, and that is labor. There is way too much. While the other is developing in the trajectory of grave scarcity, that is environment. And humanity is failing to acknowledge this meeting of excess and scarcity, and perhaps taking us to the ultimate notch in the pyramid that I put at the beginning of the talk in terms of what the nexus suggests. So maybe it's not about the shop floor representation or emissions or gender or markets or Westphalian borders. Maybe in the current system, there is a fundamental devaluation of humanity that needs to be restored. Now, is this helpful to end this observation with the daunting task it requires? I'm not sure, but I pitch it into this large basket of fears, of concerns, and of hopes, and I thank you for this volume.
Thank you very much, Guy, for this really incredibly thought-provoking intervention. Your synthesis of the main issues, but also your really great attention to the detail of the ideas presented in the contribution. So thank you very much. I'm sure there are many thoughts also by some of the authors, but I'll leave those to the end. And now actually, in fact, picking up on some of the themes of the issue, but really also some of the questions that you raised in the intervention, I will turn to Valeria, because we asked Valeria now, looking at the more general picture, we asked her for her reflections on whether industrial relations and processes are equipped to address the challenges stemming from climate change and climate policy, but also whether we might need to rethink the function of these institutions in a post-growth era, and whether this could even be an opportunity to rethink what we mean by work. So with that, I give the floor to Valeria.
Thank you very much, Kalina, and thank you very much to all, also to Paolo, for inviting me to this webinar. It's really very fascinating for me, and also I have to say an honor to be here and talk with the labor lawyers. It's not the first time which happens, so I really enjoy all the time to kind of work across borders and disciplines. So yes, I don't have a presentation myself, but I'll try to draw some kind of considerations along the line, in fact, of these fantastic special issue. And also, I think now listening to Paolo as well, and also Guy, I will actually, I think, perhaps also focus on some of the aspects which you also mentioned in your presentation. Let me start with the industrial relations institutions and processes, whether those are equipped enough to address the challenges that we are facing at the very moment, and which particularly stems from this climate change and climate policy. Well, perhaps I think the best way to answer to this question I was reflecting upon is to start from the last part of the question, which is climate change and climate policy, and particularly climate to me is more than a kind of challenge, actually is an imperative that we need to provide an answer to. Well, I was thinking how to answer to this question, and it came into my mind a kind of piece that we wrote almost a year ago with Nora Russell, who is a sociologist, who actually edited a very interesting handbook for Palgrave on labor and environmental studies. So the kind of link which was mentioned also by Guy, I mean, she actually wrote a very interesting handbook on that. And so in our contribution, this piece we wrote together with Nora, we started to reflect on this long-standing, if you like, contradiction between growing and greening the economy, and the role of industrial relations institutions, particularly trade unions and processes such as, in fact, collective bargaining. Now, let me say that the motivation why we were actually writing that kind of piece was that we felt ourselves that this contradiction, so what we called this impossibility of simultaneously growing and greening the economy at the same time, was, and still perhaps it is, rarely discussed in dominant political discourses. At least this is what we perceived and what we still believe. We felt that was, and this was an important, missing piece in this kind of broad puzzle. And it is perhaps even more so when considering, in fact, well-being as the goal that we need to reach when we talk about climate change. Now, one of the reasons at the basis of our thoughts and conviction is that environmental policies, like, in fact, European Green Deal, which has been followed, as we know, by several initiatives recently, with last but not least, also the kind of new renewable energy directive, which raised, in fact, this share of renewable energy in the European Union overall energy consumption to about 42.5% by 2030. So all these policies basically sometimes do not consider enough the life cycle of products. Neither they consider the environmental impacts which are produced at every step of the global value chain, on which production, particularly in the global north, depends, such as, for example, excavating raw materials, land use, water use, and water contamination. Especially, we believe that these policies do not consider the destruction of the livelihoods of people who happen to live where these materials are extracted, as well as the environmental costs of transportation, in case of transporting these raw materials, machines, pre-products, waste, such as all those kind of emissions of greenhouse gases which are produced exactly along the life cycle of these products. Now, research showing the environmental impacts of the life cycle of products are simply not part of these governmental policies, unfortunately. And these existing governmental policies concentrate particularly on local impacts only, and they tend to disregard the important ecological impacts and emissions. Now, why all this is important from where I wanted to start these conversations, which is in fact industrial relations, institutions, and processes. It is important because if we pose the full question, so how are these industrial relations, institutions, and processes equipped to address this kind of challenge, which is in fact climate change and climate policy? Well, the answer to me would be a yes in principle and a no de facto in reality. The yes answer holds when we think that in principle, industrial relations, institutions, and processes follow this kind of redistributive logic, that is to in fact reduce the kind of traditional called asymmetry of power within a social relationship, usually translated as a relationship between capital and labor, by social in fact re-embedding the economy, so these market effects into society. Now, particularly, interesting to also listen what Guy said, recalling some of the important piece in this special issue by Deacon and colleagues, and this idea of Polanyi, in fact, here, is reproduced as well. Now, a typical example here, which has become, I would say, the slogan at the core of the struggle against, for example, now not climate change per se, but the impact of the digital transformations, platform work in particular, on these bogus self-employed workers, is in fact, again, getting back to this idea of these embeddednesses. And here particularly, if we think about the reduction of the employee's dependency on the employer through the introduction of the standard employment contract, by which workers were attributed rights of social protection or direct dismissal and protection of income levels through collective bargaining. So all this was in fact, done within this kind of area of these embeddednesses, if you like, or re-embeddednesses of the economy into society. So de facto, in principle, we could say, yes, industrial relations institutions are there to guarantee this kind of redistributive logic. But when we look at climate change, I think probably there we have a no answer as well, which holds when we think that this redistributive logic, and here I go back to what Paolo also was mentioning at the very beginning. So this redistributive logic, which was originally based on a unique logic of economic growth, which is in fact full employment with no attention whatsoever at other dimension of socially based, I would say, form of growth. So all these kind of things are reflected now in this no answer when we think about the extent to which existing institutions of industrial relations can in fact kind of tackle the challenges, so in a good way, try to tackle the challenges of climate change. And as I said, you mentioned it also, and Paolo particularly mentioned it at the very beginning in his presentation. So I would here also strongly echoes the need of labor law to move beyond, in fact, an idea of growth as an economic growth in that sense, and also an idea of moving beyond this kind of productivistic logic, and trying to in fact rebalance production and reproduction. I think these are important and essential elements which in fact should be considered. So to reiterate a bit, to me, this unique logic of economic growth based on this economic logic of redistribution cannot anymore be defended, even by industrial relations institutions who have been based, growing and evolving upon that logic. And here I look also particularly at the trade union movement, who has to in fact move behind. And this is particularly important if we really want to be serious about the need to provide a prompt response to climate change. So I want to be clear also here. I'm not assuming or arguing that employment, and especially full employment, is not an important dimension of growth. Surely it might be. But as I said, as several crises have shown till now to us, we cannot afford to consider only full employment being the only solution, and the redistributive logic behind that being the only logic that we need to answer and to address. Now, why I say all these? Again, economic growth requires constantly more energy and more materials. And these includes particularly the raw materials that we extract from the earth to make everything we use, the land and water we use to extract those raw materials and to purchase machines, tools, products, housing, and food. And there are scientists and politicians who argue that if we produce more efficiently, we can decouple economic growth from the growth of this material, greenhouse gas emissions, water, and land use. However, there is to date no empirical evidence that this is possible. On the contrary, we have historical evidence that every time a production process becomes more efficient, this leads to the increase of production and thus to the use of more materials and energies. And environmental psychology calls this the rebound effect. Analysis also show that if we would be able to harness all the energy we use today without increasing the usage from renewable energy, there will not be enough minerals to produce the machines harnessing that. So let me say that the term renewable also energy here to me looks like a kind of euphemisms in the sense that sun and wind and water are always there. So they don't need to be actually renewed. So there we should perhaps also try to look a bit at the kind of terminology that we use. However, the machines that we need to harness that energy is made of a host of minerals. Batteries, for example, as we know, are made of cobalt, lithium, nickel, manganese, and so forth. Solar panels need rare earths, cadmium, indium, and many other. And I don't want to go more into that. We have been also reporting all these in this piece that we wrote with Nora, and I know that Nora also wrote very much around this kind of issue. What I want to say is that not all of these minerals are recyclable, and so they are not renewable. And this, in fact, brings also to another interesting thing, that even though we might think that recyclability would be improved, enormous amounts of new minerals would and will still be needed, which would be excavated by workers, particularly in the global south. And this is because these minerals, as we know, are mainly located in countries of the global south. For example, Africa and Latin America, where social rights are not respected. And this is also because international corporations are under less pressure to respect workers' rights themselves in these particular areas. So going back to what I've started, I think there is a contradiction between, in fact, economic growth and green growth, which industrial relations institutions have difficulty at the moment to resolve, simply because they tend to be, as I said, centered on the only idea of this economic logic of growth, which is reflected also into indicators of kind of good quality jobs, although, these good quality jobs indicators sometimes they have to be taken also with a kind of a pinch of salt. For example, coverage of collective bargaining. And we all know that high coverage of collective bargaining does not mean, and this is not something I say, this is, you know, also the OECD says, and many other organizations and scholars, they say, high collective bargaining coverage does not mean automatically to deliver good jobs and particularly also good life. Now, after having been perhaps a bit provocatory in my statement, I want also to add very quickly that what is interesting in that is also to see that looking, for example, at trade unions and the strategies of trade unions for just transitions, we see, and this is quite interesting, we see reflected in that also these contradictions, which comes back through in the everyday policies. Unions, for example, care for their members, but they also feel the pressure of setting their interests against those of other workers and of the natures that nurtures us. So we see, you know, this kind of well, I don't know how to say it. To me, it's really contradiction coming through. As researchers, I think, and also activists, we need to understand and also strengthen those alternatives and those interests of workers that are conducive to an ecologically and socially just way of living. And now the other question is, would this require that we need to rethink the redistributive function of current industrial relations institutions in a post-growth area? Well, certainly to me, we need to rethink the dominant culture, which is underpinning the capitalist system of production, so that the redistributive and solidaristic culture, which should be at the basis of industrial relations, is finally and strongly respected. And the idea of growth is not only, as I said, an economic category, but it should be deeply ingrained in this everyday life. And many people make sense of their life through, for example, accumulating, we know, things, for example, acquiring the newest phone call or the new car or the new clothes. Now, this idea of grow, and I think this is also very much reflected in this interesting special issue and has come also very much in light in the presentation at the very beginning, is embedded into this idea of a capitalist system of production, which follows a dominant culture of competition and individualization. And this dominant culture needs to be replaced by a culture of solidarity, a culture of well-being, through more conviviality, not only with other human beings, but also with other species, perhaps. And this seems like a very difficult task to achieve. Probably it is a very difficult task to achieve. Yet I think that the contradiction abound between individualistic competition and the needs of human beings for self-development and collective efficacy, and the interest in doing a job well for his own sake, and practices of care within and outside the workplaces. And these needs and practices can become the source or the source of another way of living, I believe, in alliance with other human beings, as I said before. Now, the last point I want to make is about, okay, so what do we need to do in terms, do we need to rethink this redistributive function of current industrial relations institutions in this post-growth area? Do we have to make it working more strongly, with means more encompassing, by having at the center what I mentioned before? Well, here I think that probably what I would say is that there is perhaps enough richnesses in the world. And the problem is how these, in fact, it is redistributed and distributed. So we go back to this idea of redistribution and distribution. But also what is important is where things and products are produced, at which price for people and planet. So there is plenty of scope, I think, for industrial relations institutions and processes of collective bargaining and workers' voice to make their voice heard globally and transnationally. And I think perhaps what industrial relations, the way how we should think about industrial relations is in fact now more and more transnationally. I think that climate change brings also this transnationality and global dimension much more to the fore, probably much more than it used to be I would say, in the past, or at least, urges us to think more transnationally. Now, what are the implications here in terms of work? Well, my personal view is that certainly there is a scope to rethink what is meant by work. In sociology, normally we use the term relational to express what work is as a category, a social category. And I think that this relational attribution, when we think about work here, might be quite illuminating, because this means that the work of someone needs to be seen not in a silo, but needs to be seen in relation to the work of somebody else. And this brings back to what has been also said at the very beginning, mentioned this idea of rebalancing production with reproduction. I think this is the key message. And in fact, the idea of, let's say, overcoming this dichotomy between also paid employment in the public sphere and, in fact, social reproductive unpaid in the more private sphere. I would also perhaps say that at least the research we have been conducting, particularly in my research team at KU Leuven at the very moment, shows that unpaid is increasingly becoming important, not only in the area of the social reproductive labor, but also in the paid employment area in terms of what labor law normally considered to be the violation of the law, wage theft. This wage theft is becoming also income earnings theft for more freelancers and self-employed, real self-employed people, and we should pay attention also to that. So the interconnection and interdependencies, I think, around work in a global, in a much more relational way, are becoming more important, and also are actually changing. Yeah, I mean, probably.
Valeria, I'm sorry. I might have to stop you soon, but finish your sentence, of course.
Yeah, I just finished. I wanted just to conclude with a positive note, despite the fact I've been quite probably provocative. So I believe in the capacity of a right climate change and a right climate policy to help us fixing what has remained to be unfixed till now. Therefore, I believe in the capacity that we still have to revalue the real meaning of work, which is in fact socially important at the very moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Valeria. And sorry to cut you short. There is so much in what you said. But since you spoke a lot about trade unions and I think raised some really important issues, I think I'm also going to go straight to Ben. And in fact, it's nice that he's speaking after you, so maybe he can pick on some of the things that you said. So Ben, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Lena. Yeah, hi, my name is Ben. I'm the Climate and Energy Advisor at the European Trade Union Confederation. We represent 45 million workers from 93 trade unions across Europe at the European and EU level. We're a partner organization to the ETUI, who I'm sure you all know very well. Before I get into this, I would like to emphasize that I'm very much not an academic or a lawyer. My background is in strike organizing for low-paid workers and in climate campaigning. So I'm going to focus my response on my experience of being on both sides and in, I suppose, in the middle of that red and green tension that Guy unpacked so well in his presentation. And then also kind of build on what Valeria said about like focusing on the global south. I'm going to raise one example that highlights a problem that I think even still, when we think we're doing the right thing in terms of using law to protect global south workers, we actually may be harming them, at least in the kind of shorter medium term. And I think where this kind of problem comes from is what Guy mentioned on the very quick maturation of just transition work. And I think it has, led to some perhaps unintended consequences. And we're still facing some of those tensions now, even if many of the actors involved, like we all want to see the same thing, to a large extent. I'm going to outline very quickly a recent legal example. I was going to say, like, sorry if you find this boring, but I guess you all don't find this kind of stuff boring. So yeah, in April 2022, an Italian civil society organization filed a complaint with Italy's national contact point at the OECD, the entity who's responsible for ensuring compliance with OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. And the complaint was basically against FCA Italy, which is a big automotive company, which is part of the huge Stellantis group. It includes like GM and a lot of big conglomeration of like a lot of big car manufacturers, and specifically on its increasing use of cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo in the production of lithium-ion batteries. So this, yeah, relates a lot to what Barry was saying. Some mines in this region are known to have like horrendous human rights violations associated with how they work. And I think this example is a kind of a representative example of what we mean when we talk about a just transition and how we're actually going to achieve it. The core issue was about a lack of transparency concerning supply chains and in relation to human rights risks posed by cobalt suppliers. And it was about how like the car company FCA Italy hadn't adequately disclosed information about its cobalt suppliers against the OECD guidelines. The company is based in the Netherlands, so the case moved there. And then in February of this year, the court published an initial assessment accepting the complaint, and the case is ongoing. And in some ways, like this is a great example. We remain very optimistic about this case and the potential example it can set to force other suppliers to, you know, behave in a way that we should be a bare minimum of doing business. But I think it also raises attention. Like just recognizing the problems with the mines in the Congo doesn't mean that we have fully addressed the challenges of a just transition, even if we have successfully brought them, you know, to court, or at least in the process of that. It actually remains unclear what will happen to the jobs in these mines. Like, will they be shut down? For how long? How long will the workers there have to wait before it's reopened with fair conditions? How do we ensure they receive support in the interim? You know, instead of advocating for ending the use of such mines, we need to find a legal means to both force them to change their working practices, but also protect the workers involved in the interim. I think this highlights the extent of the challenge we face and the duty we have in the global north to show like true solidarity and recognize the impacts that the decisions we make in Europe have on workers around the world, even when we think we're doing the right thing. And I don't mean to like dismiss the intention behind the Italian CSOs that took this legal case. It looks like something that could be like a really good starting point for further action. But if we're serious about global justice and respecting workers' rights, not just in Europe or the global north, we have to be careful about what we're arguing for. And I know in the publication, there's the interesting example, I think a guy mentioned it in his presentation as well, of the Chilean workers in the coal industry, demanding that they get new jobs in the renewable energy sector. And that's really, really great. But I think there is maybe like a difference there between those workers themselves arguing for their own position, as opposed to a civil society organizations in Italy arguing at least for a temporary closure of workers doing their jobs in the global south. And obviously we can't support a mine that has horrendous working conditions, but we can also not support further deepening poverty of the most vulnerable around the world. I don't speak Italian, and I haven't been able to find what the CSO's response to the case was, or their kind of like justification for it beyond kind of like basic reasoning. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't necessarily take this case, but I think we need to think about the impacts on the workers around the world. As Guy mentioned, you know, trade unions have moved a long way when it comes to environmental issues in many cases. And, you know, I've been on both sides of that. But trade unions are first and foremost about pay and conditions, and we should not forget this, and we shouldn't forget who we're impacting. Yeah, so just to kind of tie this back also to what Nova writes in relation to like legal mobilization scholarship. And it's not like her case, but she mentions Claire Kilpatrick, who challenges the kind of the difference between NGOs and trade unions, and says like this kind of tension is often overstated given their complementary claims and activism in the field of labor rights. I'm not exactly sure about this. I think it may be true in some cases, but not always. I'd be interested, you know, we don't know, but like, would a global North trade union have had this blind spot about the workers involved in taking the legal case? In the publication, it's also said that NGOs may now act as important advocates for those in the informal economy without official trade union support. And that's another interesting question. I think it also mentions like how trade unions don't use environmental law enough. I think that's also true. But trade unions are not civil society organizations in the kind of NGO sense. Yeah, I don't think they're always the same thing. At ETUC, 25% of the members we represent are industrial workers. and many of them find things that climate CSOs still say, like there are no jobs on a dead planet, very offensive. So I think I'd just like to kind of raise a question and maybe end with like a few reminders that we should not stop asking ourselves when we're doing this, like who is bringing the litigation? What impact will it have beyond our narrow aims? And like, what can we actually do to protect all those impacted by these admirable aims? Yeah, I'll leave it there for now, but I'm like happy to take questions in a bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. And I actually even saw one question already in the chat that sort of speaks to the also this idea of, you know, the discussion we're having here. You know, how does it touch really the workers on the ground and which workers? But maybe we'll come to that in a minute. But I would like to turn to Anne, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your reactions as the editor of the journal, but of course also as an expert in labor law.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Kalina, for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here in my editor capacity, and I'd like to reiterate Kalina's thanks to Amir Pazfuks, who's the deputy editor of the journal, who did all the hard work on this special issue but couldn't be here today because of his commitment in his day job. So I haven't got a presentation, but I have got a prop. I don't know if you can see this, but this is the actual issue. This is the real thing. The International Journal of Comparative Labour Law and Industrial Relations has been running since 1985. It's published by ETUI, and our focus is on international and comparative scholarship of interest to a worldwide readership. And we do a mix of open articles, open issues for individual articles submitted by scholars, and special issues where a group of scholars submit papers on a theme. And I just wanted to say how delighted we were to be able to publish this special issue. Obviously, there are some fantastic papers. All the papers in this issue are of exceptionally high quality. And I particularly love the breadth of scholarly approaches that are represented here, from deep philosophical reflection on the nature of capitalism to detailed empirical work on the ground with many, many layers in between. And obviously also the profound importance of the issues raised to the future, both of our discipline of labour law, but also more importantly to the future of the planet. So thank you very much for the opportunity to publish these. It's been an absolute delight. It's also been a joy to reread the set of papers wearing my scholarly hat rather than my editorial hats. They are quite different hats. And I just wanted to offer one reflection. I'm keen that we have a chance to hear from the authors, so I'm going to keep this really brief. So the other existential threat that faces our discipline is automation. So we've already seen the rise of platform work. That's becoming old news now, I think. And a lot of current scholarly attention is devoted to the use of algorithms to manage people, with a particular focus on how we can control or manage something we don't properly understand, which can pose real threats to working people, both in terms of equal treatment and also in terms of just basic dignity at work. And the next big thing on the horizon in that sort of tech space is the possibility of jobs starting to disappear. And those might be manual jobs which can be carried out by robots, or they might be desk jobs which can be taken over by increasingly sophisticated AI systems. As Cindy Eslin's brilliant book demonstrates, a lot of the claims made about our technological future and its impact are exaggerated, but it's still a real issue, I think, that we need to confront. And the question I wanted to just raise for our authors is how you see the relationship between this labour environment challenge, which is obviously a huge challenge, as we've already discussed, and what we might loosely call the labour technology challenge. And I'm really curious about whether they overlap or whether they affect different parts of the economy. Does technology present us with greener options, or does it in fact increase the demand for energy to power ever bigger and more sophisticated computer systems? And how can we limit the productivity imperative when technology is pushing us to do more rather than less with our working time? I realize those are some quite challenging questions, but I would love to hear what you think about them and to see whether there's any mileage in addressing both of those existential challenges together. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. And we're lucky that the next speaker is in fact one of the authors, one of the contributors to the special issue. So maybe he would be willing to tackle these questions. It is also something that Valeria mentioned as well in her intervention. So perhaps she would like to intervene on this point as well later on, but doesn't have to. Anil, it is a great pleasure to have you here. Just kick off to give your reflections as an author who was involved in the project from the very beginning, and to kick off perhaps a discussion with some of the other colleagues who are present. So the floor is yours. And you feel free to answer Anne's questions.
Thank you, Kalina, and thank you to the organizers, Paolo, for hosting us, and Anne for editing. Sorry, we made your job a little tougher by writing wrong English, but we promise to try. That is not always easy for people whose first language is not English. In any event, let me make 3 quick remarks from the perspective of industrial relations, both as a professor and also as someone who works with field staff at the ILO who go into factories and they audit labor standards. So I have those 2 hats, both as a researcher and professor, as well as a coach for people who have to solve day-to-day problems. Number 1 is that our perspective in our paper, and I don't want to talk a lot about our paper, but I'll just use that as a lens to speak on behalf of perhaps all the papers, because they all touch on these themes, is that the old paradigm is that we now have transition to new industries and to sustainable economy, so we should protect those who are displaced and we should allow them to transition to new industries. But to me, this does not change the discourse, because it completely leaves out 2/3 of the world's labor force. And you can guess who I'm talking about. I'm talking about workers who are informal. They're not on a payroll. They work for themselves or sometimes for employers, but not always. And most GDP calculations do not factor their work in. They do so indirectly because this informal workforce is essentially subsidizing the formal production of goods and services. So our lens has been, I think I can say this for the whole issue and for the conference, is that we need to change the conversation by expanding what labor law means and what its goals and aims are. And Paolo gave an excellent overview, and many of those points were reinforced by Guy, so we don't have to go over that again. But I have to say that several of the papers address very specific parts of the implications of our work and for this larger need to change the conversation. So let me say that, secondly, that our work is addressing old informality. And this is very different from the new informality. For example, Anne mentioned the gig and platform work or algorithms being used to manage people. These are new forms of management that are rendering work that was otherwise well protected and recognized by labor law is now gradually being informalized or gradually being exposed to all kinds of risks. The old informality has never had any impact of these technologies, and they are not directly affected right now because they don't always have an employer. They are not covered by labor law, and they're plagued by disadvantages of all kinds. And Valeria pointed to some of this. These workers, and this is the 2/3 that I'm talking about, they have no or low levels of education. They have very few resources to go and improve their lives, and they have no power and no voice. So we need to transition, and let me use the word transition in a slightly different way. I think we have to transition from talking about regulating the employment relationship, which has been the focus of labor law, to regulating work and working conditions. And this is a very significant transition, which we still don't have, and we haven't even begun to attack it. Another way of putting the same transition is that we often talk about how informality should be reduced and formality should be introduced. In fact, the ILO has a big set of recommendations, and a lot of their work is focused on how to make informal work formal. And to our mind, again, that does not get at the real transition, because formality is not a goal in itself. And it almost appears like it is self-serving for governments or businesses to have things more formal, because then they can exercise more control. But what does it do for the workers? So instead, I would propose, based on our work, that this transition should not be informal to formal, but rather from unacceptable working conditions to decent work. So if we change our focus to making their lives more livable and more just, then we would achieve that transition. Lastly, my last point can be made by taking one element of this transition that I'm talking of, and that is worker voice. There are many elements, but we don't have time to go into all of them. And this is the most significant for industrial relations. That is, can labor law expand its views of voice enough to include the 2/3 of the global labor workforce? So notice now voice is attached to your employment status right now. But if we free it of that constraint, then you can have voice for waste pickers or domestic workers or street hawkers and so on and so forth. And the way to get there, if I'm not a labor lawyer, but I'm just going to do a thought experiment here with you, that one possible path for getting to voice for these workers is to guarantee voice at a more fundamental level, not in labor law, essentially, but at a more constitutional level. And we have several models of this, including several in Latin America, of the right to voice or the right to union membership being guaranteed at the constitutional level. Then the next step would be to oblige governments to operationalize voice through different mechanisms appropriate to each subgroup of this informal workforce. So sometimes it may happen through a trade union in the traditional way that we understand trade unions. Sometimes it could be through a non-governmental organization, community organization. And in our case, the waste pickers of Brazil organize themselves in associations. But this association has no legal status under the labor law, and it does not extend or give to the workers any bargaining rights. So if it can be operationalized through a variety of mechanisms, the next step would be to follow up this voice guarantee with certain rights that come, the rights to bargain. Then you may ask, well, if there's no employer, who do you bargain with? And this is where, again, Valeria's point becomes very salient. That is, we have to think of work as relational. That is, it's not that they're doing this work in a vacuum. They're doing it for someone. There's a customer, there's a consumer, there's a government, there are authorities in the area. So again, if you follow the work of the waste pickers, but also generally the SEVA organization in India, which has worked with a large variety of workers in this informal sector. They say, we negotiate with who control resources that we need to improve our work lives. So it can be a level of government, can be local, state, regional, federal, even international. It can be for waste pickers, the wholesalers, the companies that do the wholesaling of recycled waste, the recycling industry, etc., etc. So you have to follow the work and see who controls the resources that could improve the lives of these workers. And if these workers then have a voice and they have the right to bargain under the law, they would take it from there. We don't have to belabor the point, but this is the area in which labor law needs to expand. This is the work that we try to focus on in our own paper, but I think generally a lot of the other papers support this view, with Anya's and Flavia's work on redefining outside of colonization, because when colonizers came.
I found this on the web for renegotiate with people who control resources that we need to improve our work lives. So it can be a level of government, it can be local, state, regional, federal, even international. It can be a four-way speakers.
What was that?
No idea. I don't know where this
So
came
you
from.
have to follow the work and see who controls the resources that could improve the lives of these workers. And if his workers didn't have a voice and they had the right to bargain under the law, they would take it from there. We don't have to be able to point, but this is the area in which labor, the work that we tried to focus on in our own.
That's the answer to your question about automation, right?
Yes, I'm sorry about that. I don't know. I'm trying to figure out where this came from.
Yeah, I think that it's the transcription. Maybe there's a transcription service that got turned on somehow.
I don't know. It was not from, yeah. My account was muted. I'm so sorry. Please continue. Hopefully my colleague Maria managed to turn it off.
Yeah, the bot was simply repeating what I said.
Strange.
So I think that I'm done. This has been a pleasure to be part of, and I'm happy to stop there and take questions from the audience.
Thank you very much. And I'm really sorry about, I'm not sure what happened, but hopefully that won't interfere with us. I couldn't see if it was from any of our screens, but I think whatever it is turned off now. So thank you very much, Daniel. Apologies for the interruption. And I actually have a few questions, but I think I will ask a few from the chat. And I would like to also, again, raise the point that Anne mentioned, which I think is a very important one, as one of the questions, which is, how do we see the relationship between the labor environment challenge and the labor and tech challenge? Which I think, I have a few thoughts on that, but I'll leave that maybe for the end. And so at this point, I think I will also ask another question, which I already alluded to, and I think it also speaks to what Anil was just talking about the importance of, workers' voice. The question in the chat was, how can we, the discussion we're having here is really interesting, but how can this be understood, by workers at the grassroots level? So, this nexus between labor and the environment, how, can this, or how can it be sort of be a clear concern of workers who are mostly concerned with keeping their jobs, working conditions, and salary? So this was another question that was raised in the chat. So I don't know if any of you, I think I see Ben would like to answer. I don't know if any of the other contributors to the special issue would also like to speak. You're very welcome to just raise your hand.
Yeah, just quickly on the question about does this appeal to workers on the ground level, and what role do unions play in that? I think it depends what you're talking about, but most before I joined the ETC, I worked on a project for 4 years working with offshore oil and gas workers in the UK on their needs for a just transition. And when we first kind of surveyed them in 2019, I think 8% had heard of a just transition. They didn't know what it was, the term. But that's not to say they weren't concerned about climate change and they didn't know that their jobs were at risk. And it's not to say that they weren't willing to retrain. Like, I think 75% of them were open to retrain to join renewables. I think globally 2/5 of people have never heard of the term climate change, but that's not to say they're not experiencing it. And I think a lot of it is to do with kind of how the messaging we do around this. And that's where the idea of, justice and the just transition comes in.
Thank you very much. I see Tonia Novitz has raised her hand as well. So Tonia, feel free to join in.
Yeah, there's so much to respond to, and I promised myself I wasn't going to say too much. I was going to do more listening, but I did want to respond to what Ben said earlier, and it's entirely, appropriate, the concern that you raise. And I thought that you might be going to speak about aspects of the EU Green Deal. I think the Sustainable Finance Initiative is really dangerous in terms of actually directing investment back into the EU rather than addressing environmental issues elsewhere. I think the same concerns can be raised in relation to the proposed forced labour import ban and the corporate sustainable responsibility corporate social responsibility directive, just in that sense that there doesn't seem to be an obvious mechanism for genuinely making sure that at member state level you engage with the voices of those people at work who are affected in third countries, and if you do, how you actually access the people who Anil was talking about earlier who are at work and will be profoundly affected by certain decisions that are made, but don't have necessarily the representative structures there. So, I mean, I do think that this is something that we have to be aware of in terms of power dynamics. The suggestion about human rights claims is not that they're a panacea. And I think that's why I use Gráinne de Burke's framework of human rights experimentalism, because it really matters how we identify and frame the claims, who we involve within that process. There are important power dynamics there. And I think that the Inter-American Court has just been so much more progressive than the European Court of Human Rights that to some extent we want to frame that material and put it to the European Court of Human Rights, particularly about ensuring that there is agency. So it's just fine to say Articles 2 and 8 can help with environmental concerns, but until we get the agency around voice and freedom of association, form those kinds of alliances and recognition of those people who are broadly at work, we get nowhere. I do have all sorts of things I could say on other issues, but I'm going to stop there because I'm just finding the rest of the discussion so interesting. But if there's a chance to comment at the end on Anne's question, I'd love to do that.
Thank you very much, Tonia. Just checking. Would perhaps any of the speakers like to respond to anything that was said? I would also like to invite the audience to post any questions, any further questions they might have in the Q&A section. And actually, I think maybe one question that we haven't answered yet, just to throw out there, because we're mentioning the term just transition quite a lot, and we know there's different definitions. I mean, one of the questions that was asked is whether, do you find the existing definitions of just transition still relevant? And I think that's very important, and that's in fact one of the questions that's picked up on by the piece from Beren Olmos-Liponi about enriching the term just transition, particularly with a view to the particular challenges faced by countries in the global south. So I wonder if any of you have any comments on that, or in anything else that was said. Feel free to respond to the comments. Please, Anya, sorry.
You're inviting me to say.
Yes, sorry.
I'm not sure that I'll answer this question directly. I just wanted to perhaps also pick up on a few things that have been said. I wanted to, first of all, thank everybody for such engagement with our special issue and all the contributions and such thoughtful comments. I guess a couple of things I wanted to say relate maybe, from the perspective of our paper. I'm not going to talk about the paper that Flavia Massimo and I contributed a lot. All I'm going to say is that it's in a sense perhaps a bit of a misfit for a session that focuses on industrial relations, because what we were trying to do in our paper is decenter those sorts of forms of work and foreground and center, or at least ask that we pay attention to different forms of making a living, livelihoods, and so on, including those that are land-based, care economy-based, and so on. Because those are, we tend to think of them as marginal, but actually a large portion of the world's population still relies on subsistence livelihoods, if not directly, then in a hybrid sort of way, because people often subsidize their incomes through kind of participation in a hybrid sort of economy. What I wanted to say, I guess, relates a little bit to what Ben's really thoughtful example, and I think the questions that you posed that we should be sort of aware of and attentive to when policymakers or different kinds of actors make decisions about the kinds of strategies that we pursue. I think those are really important questions. And on that kind of example that you cited of this Italian case, what I wanted to add is that, of course, the consequences for workers resulting from transitional kind of our policies, such as those that seek to close mining operations or some other sorts of operations, are something that we must be attentive to, but also in contexts that are sort of dominated by extractive industries, for example, there are also people who are engaged in land-based livelihoods, other workers, even though we may not think of them as workers when they are engaged in subsistence livelihoods, but their kind of possibilities of reproducing their own lives and engaging in those, on the ways in which they make a living are also impacted already by those extractive activities. So it's very complicated. There are lots of layers to it. And in another project that I'm working on, both in the project that I'm working on currently with Flavia Massimo here in Brazil, but also which has a case study in Sudbury in Canada, but also in another project that I'm working on with the David Suzuki Foundation, Saba Khan, and as well as Supriya Ruth. That in that project, we're looking at kind of what just transition means and actually trying to get a better sense for how different countries define what is just about just transition and how they sort of articulate both the principle, but also how this principle is kind of then operationalized through different sorts of policies. And what we're seeing is that transitional justice, or just transition specifically, is very unevenly applied. It's either not even, the vast majority of countries that we looked at, and we're looking specifically at the NDCs, so the national determined contributions that countries file under the Paris Agreement, to talk about the ways that they are making progress towards decarbonization or lowering their carbon emissions. The vast majority of the agreements that or NDCs we looked at don't make any reference to the just transition principles of the ILO. And that's quite a shocking finding. Of course, there are different ways in which they talk about transitional justice processes, but they don't all talk about just transition. And again, that kind of link with the ILO principles is quite thin. And then in the context of Canada, for example, where some studies have been done on how just transition policies have been implemented on the ground. For instance, in the coal sector, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, for example, has found that the ways in which those policies have been operationalized and the plans implemented have in a sense reproduced existing inequalities in the labor market. So co-workers, the core co-workers have been supported through a range of different measures. And at the same time, all the workers in the wider ecosystem that supports coal mining have been given a lot less kind of support. So I suppose it goes back to those questions that Ben raised that are really important, that we really have to think about the impacts, and we And I guess it goes in a sense to the point we're trying to make in the paper, is that the world of work is a much wider thing, and the notion of work should be really thought of in a much wider sense, and that people who are engaged in land-based livelihoods, for example, or in the care economy, or in different sorts of solidarity-based economies that aren't mainstream, are also need to also be thought of when we are thinking about transitional justice, for example.
Thank you very much, Anya. I see Anil has his hand raised. So
I'm trying to unmute myself. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, just a very quick point, and that is that, you know, the industrial relations perspective is that it's the lack of voice that leads to injustice in the workplace. So even though we are kind of obsessed with this transition to new energy economy and climate change, it is not the first transition that we are going through in the history of industrialization. So we have gone through several transitions. And I think there is a methodology there. There's an experience, there's empirical evidence. And we should be making better use of that than we are. We don't have to reinvent another system just to deal with climate change. From a more fundamental perspective, if workers who are affected by change have voice and they have been enabled through laws and through institutions, they will tell us what they need and what justice to them means. It is the lack of voice that then creates the scramble towards finding new solutions. The same thing applies incidentally to the tech transition that Anne was talking about. That is, people being managed through algorithms or gig work. You know, gig workers have suffered because they don't have voice. But if they had voice, and these case studies exist, they can use their voice to at least improve. I don't know if they will always get a fair shake, but certainly they can get a shake instead of being totally disempowered. Thank you.
thank you. I think those are really, really crucial points. I see Tonya would like to speak, perhaps to this point.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to basically affirm what Anil is saying. I think that green and digital transitions should not necessarily be combined in the way that we've seen at EU level in terms of post-COVID funding. I don't think they're based on the same rationale at all. I think that the digital transitions are highly profit-based. They might have benefits for consumers or they might not, but they are, you know, they're part of a productionist economy, and the moral demands of green transitions are very different to the digital. And so I don't like seeing them combined in that way. I see it as highly problematic. But I would completely agree with Anil that what they have in common, I think, is the need to reconsider how we understand work and voice. So the kind of case studies I've been doing is starting a study on green and digital transitions. And what comes up as case studies are the exclusion of people from employment status as child and forced labor, hidden migrant labor in the electronics industry that a colleague of mine, Witwitsa Andrisevic, has been investigating, remote and platform and highly, you know, precarious work. And what this calls on us to do is reconsider again what is work and how we provide that voice. And I think we do have experience of this. And in a sense, it takes us back to forms of the Industrial Revolution, where we have technological change, and we have to navigate different forms of worker combinations and different understandings of work and collectivism. And I don't think it's so foreign to us. I think we can do that work, but I've been speaking to some really interesting people who are doing that work now and thinking about designing this around platform work that would be interesting to share more widely in the future. And hopefully we'll start to do that with an event in Bristol in January. But I mean, there are real possibilities here. So I think as long as we move into that zone when we think about this constructively, we can get to places. And we shouldn't use a human rights rhetoric, although it's very useful for universalism, to deny that kind of work on the ground. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Valeria, you want to mention something?
Yes, thank you very much. It's a very interesting conversation and discussion. I fully agree with the issue of Anil about the voice of workers. I think that there is a scope to absolutely capture this issue of the voice and make the voice heard. And this is a kind of possibilities that the labor movement, I think, has nowadays to try to kind of, well, strengthen that kind of side of the coin. Going back to the question also of Anne about the relationship between these labor, environmental, labor, technological challenges. Now, yeah, in the gig economy has been already said a bit. Well, what we see nowadays, particularly in a recent study we are doing in manufacturing, is that certainly, and that's why also trade unions as well at the European level, international level, they talk about twin transitions. So these two things, they go together. And in fact, they go together because in fact, employers use technology in most of the cases strategically to kind of try to cope with a kind of environmental challenge. So technology and digitalization in manufacturing, and I'm talking about auto, I'm talking about chemical whatsoever, is used also in that way. Now, this brings to me also another important aspect that, for example, is important for bargaining. And so again, we are back to the industrial relations institutions and processes. I think there is perhaps a need also, it's true what Ben says, unions are here for, pay, wages and jobs. But it's also true that now these twin transitions, they raise also challenges for workers. One of the challenge we see, I see important is work intensification. And work intensification is important, has a lot of implications for health and safety. We know that. But work intensification should be on the table of bargaining at the firm level, sector level, and perhaps also European level. I don't know. I mean, it is an important, perhaps it is there already, but yes, it is an important aspect, which in fact is a kind of results of this combination, in fact, of the two transitions and challenges that Anne was mentioning. And yeah, I stop it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valeria. I just wanted to add very briefly to that. I mean, I posted in the chat that we had an ETUI working paper this year that reflects a little bit on this relationship between the green and digital transitions. And I haven't worked on this much myself, but we had some colleagues looking specifically at the implications of remote work, the green implications of remote work. And what's really interesting, and I think this goes in general for the relationship between the green and digital transitions, is that we really need more research. And there are so many sort of floating, so many moving parts in this equation that whether certain kinds of technology is good for the environment really depends on the kind of more global picture of lifestyle choices plus particular green policies and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to mention that is also very interesting. So there is a lot of room there also for further research. So I know that a couple of people have to leave. Annie has already left, so thank you, Annie, for joining. We have a few more minutes, however, and I just wanted to mention there were more comments in the chat by some of the audience on the term of just transition. One of them mentioned that really just transition is a best a floor rather than a ceiling of our ambitions, and I think that's a really important point. And the other one, which I think was also mentioned and highlighted, is that just transition needs a global approach. And I think this is something that certainly at the sort of EU level, I think is not always taken into account, and that has been mentioned by many of you. I see, Anil, your hand is raised. Did you want to, is this the previous hand?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you, say goodbye, and a shameless plug for a session that I will do on December 1st at ADAPT, a conference in Bergamo. We will have a panel where Evans Kalula from South Africa, myself, and Eleonora Peliza from Argentina will speak on the informal workforce in developing economies. So if people have an interest, I posted a link in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I know you have to go, so I'll say goodbye to you. So last few minutes for any final comments, reflections, perhaps by some of our speakers. Paolo, I don't know if you also want to say anything to conclude.
Yeah, probably just a few thoughts about, again, the scope of this webinar, the focus on industrial relations and the importance to bring an industrial relations perspective into this discussion on the labor environment nexus. And our idea of industrial relations, of course, in this case, is a broad one. It's one that, as Anil said, includes values for democracy, which is the possibility for any kind of worker to raise voice in defense of their interests and rights. But industrial relations in a broad sense also includes another very important value that we should bring into the attention of the discussion, which is solidarity. Solidarity, it's a very cross-cutting principle when it comes to both labor law and environmental law. It has to do also with some renounces for the individual interest to reach a broader and higher collective one or general interest. And I think that when it comes to industrial relations, it's also very important to bring to the attention the possibility to create channels for solidarity, not only within the traditional articulation of legal and industrial relation pluralism, which is based on the assumption of a conflict of interest between capital and labor and the possibility of labor to create channels for solidarity vis-a-vis capital, but also to include in a more neo-pluralistic perspective other interests in the this joint effort to join in cooperation and solidarity to achieve a broader and higher societal goals, which is saving the planet on the one hand and guaranteeing better working conditions and welfare for people and communities.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Since we're almost out of time, unless somebody else has any more comments or points they want to raise, I think I might stop us here. I thank the speakers and the audience who also stuck with us for now almost 2 hours. Thank you very much to all of the contributors to Special Issue, to the editors again, to our guest speakers today, also for taking the time, to my colleagues, Maria and Crystal, who are involved in the organization, and also to the interpreters who are following us for these 2 hours. So thank you all again for this stimulating discussion. I hope we have the occasion to pick up on these topics in the future and to see each other in person soon as well. So have a good evening from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Kalina. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kalina. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kalina. Thank you, Paolo.
Thank you. Take